Okay, I'll be as quick as I can. It's more of a pitch than a paper. So what I'm going to talk about is a new project that I'm scoping with a number of colleagues, two of whom are co-authors of this particular paper, and others actually are in the room, Philip and Wei, involved in this discussions about what this project will look like. So it's a study of using the least worst term we could think of, emerging market multinationals. So by this we are meaning, and I'm very well aware it's not a great term, countries that are at an intermediate stage of development, from which there are beginning to become multinational companies, in other words, so exerting influence as emerging global players. So that's the group of firms that we are interested in studying and refer to as emerging market multinationals. And what we want to do in the beginning process is to think through the kind of institutional effects that emanate both from the home and the host countries of such companies, what sort of questions we might ask and how we might put a network together that would look at such firms. So I think we all know that there's a growing influence on the global economy of a group of actors, including the state obviously and including multinational companies from emerging economies, such that if you follow patterns of foreign direct investment, you see that firms in this category now account for approaching a third of total foreign direct investment, up in 2 decades from under a tenth. So it's a very significant development in aggregate terms, and we know that some of the particular initiatives within the global economy in the 21st century are emerging from some of the countries we're interested in, of which the best example would be China, of course, with the One Belt, One Road. I'll come back to this slide in a second. The sheer scale of this development, driven by and organised explicitly by the Chinese state, is also opening up considerable opportunities for Chinese multinational companies to engage in, I suppose, investments associated with this infrastructure project itself, but also the way in which that infrastructure project will create opportunities for further investments. So I think part of what we're seeing in this respect, in terms of the Chinese influence, but also a similar, if not quite on the same scale, set of influences emerging from countries such as India, Russia, some big economies in Latin America, is new institutional influences being brought to bear on the global economy. So further diversity of institutional influences being brought into what we call the global mix. And linked to the themes of the network, this is opening up very important new sites within the global economy, within which we are convinced institutional experimentation is going on. So, in terms of the 3 types of effect, I'm going to say a few words about each of these. I suppose the path extremely well trodden in work on multinational companies is to look at the institutional influences from the home country, and so there's a big tradition, even in the mainstream of international business, and certainly comparative institutional applications to international management, looking at ways in which the institutions in the country of origin inform the internationalization process of multinational companies in particular, and more generally the kind of strategies and practices that they deploy more generally. And so I suppose one question we are beginning with is, well, when you apply that to multinational companies from emerging economies, what are the types of actor or groups of actors that become relevant that are maybe not studied extensively in relation to multinationals from more established economies? And so here, to give some illustrations, we're thinking about, in the Indian case, for example, 2 types of actor who look particularly important in that context. One is family-based foundations, which have control over and influence over some very, very large Indian multinational companies. Tata is the best example. And the second is groups or networks of what we might call returnee entrepreneurs. So many of the big Indian IT companies are not only run but owned by Indian nationals immigrated to Silicon Valley or other parts of the world, returned to set up in the last 15, 20 years companies that then become multinational companies and based in India, have their original base in India. So networks of returnee entrepreneurs, family-based foundations. I think the other actor with which it's extremely important to engage in this respect is the state. I mean, we know that the state is probably an under-researched actor in the operations of multinational companies more generally. So many of the reasons why US multinationals are as they are is to do with the influence of the US state, for example. But it becomes particularly important in the context of, say, Chinese or Russian firms whose investments need explicit approval of the state if they're to be international. And so one of the things we want to do is compare these influences from the relevant types of actor across emerging economies in a process that we refer to as institutional conditioning. So very well established conceptually in this area, only partially applied to the particular case of a country of origin effect in EMNCs. Second, where multinational companies from emerging markets have governance problems or coordination problems, in what ways does internationalisation help them or present opportunities for them to solve those problems? So two sets of example here. One relates to Russia. I'm certainly no expert on Russia, but Gerhard, our colleague, is. And there was a thesis in students of Russia, observers of Russia, during the reform processes of the 1990s and early 2000s, the development of large privately owned companies, particularly as they began to internationalise, would create the demand for corporate governance reform, for the sorts of reforms that would protect the investors or protect the assets of investors, and that the growth of private companies and the internationalisation of companies would create this sort of demand, which would create a political pressure that the government would would eventually give into and engage in sorts of reforms that companies were pressing them for and international investors would expect. We know that's manifestly not what's happened in Russia. Putin and others didn't want it to happen, and it hasn't happened. And so, I mean, the link to internationalisation is that there's evidence among some Russian multinationals that they've solved the governance problems that come from the sort of uncertainty associated with institutions in the home country by locating key assets, key operations outside of Russia. And so locating key functions in the major financial centres in the Western world, listing themselves on stock markets in other countries, seeking to reassure international investors that this provides the sorts of assurances that they need, fighting their legal battles in the courts in other countries are examples of the sorts of things that we're interested in. We might think of this as a direct form of borrowing on institutions from other countries. In other cases, such as in the Brazilian mining sector, there were well-documented cases, particularly in the work of Roberta Argazelli and John Geary, looking at the way in which Brazilian mining companies have internationalised, the way they've used this to build a network of information about what they perceive to be best practice, which is then developed into standardised, formalised policies, which apply in Brazil and elsewhere, not based on Brazilian norms, but what they perceive to be those of international best practice, heavily drawing on those of the US. And we refer to this process as institutional arbitrage. And then the third element is, I suppose, looking at those effects and tracing through, well, what does this mean for the institutional configurations in the home countries of such firms? Does it act to change those institutions, or does it consolidate them? And we can think of contrasting cases from the limited evidence that there is. One would be that we know that in some cases emerging market multinationals have observed new practices which they've taken back to their home country. These have become spread into supplying companies. They've been, to some extent, they've used the firms as lead or flagship firms within their home economies. There's a process of isomorphism or emulation from other firms within those countries, gradually leading to a process of changes that become institutionalized. In other cases, however, institutional arbitrage on the part of firms can consolidate the existing institutional configuration. So if you think about the case I was just mentioning of Russian firms internationalizing, using institutions in other countries to solve their governance or coordination problems, no longer are such firms pressing for reforms if they have found a solution to their problems in other countries. They're quite happy for this previous status quo of institutional configurations in Russia to continue. In fact, it may suit their interests if their competitors have not used internationalization to solve their problems, that they continue to suffer from the uncertainty associated with perceived institutional deficiencies. I'll be 1 minute, actually. So we then look at whether that's institutional, whether this is bringing institutional change or consolidation. What we want to do is put together a network, which we're beginning to do, and I'll indicate in a moment how we would like to take it further, which draws on experts in each country that we build into our network. The starting point here has been China, so conversations with Wei go back a year or so, almost, well, to Magog last year, and since then Wei, I think, is formally committed. I'm going to say this publicly, so it's difficult for you to back out. Formally committed to being part of this network, and we are seeking joint funds and a case study company in discussion. So that's proceeding. In Russia, Gerhard's contacts with at GSOM in St. Petersburg with Andrei Panabratov, who has written about Russian multinationals, it has led to an agreement on that side. In Latin America, we have a number of links in the countries I've mentioned. One expert located in each of those 4 countries with varying degrees of progression in terms of commitment of resources to this. And finally, in India, we don't have academics on the ground, but we do have colleagues within Loughborough University. Ravi Shankar, who some of you may know, who is Indian originally, has done all of his work in India, is not physically based there at the moment, but is expert enough in the distinctiveness of the Indian context to engage in sensitive, informed research. There are gaps in our coverage of this network, and the obvious one is in Africa. So we have had the beginnings of some discussions with academics who are based in, have expertise in particular African countries. But this is a site of great interest, both as a site for incoming foreign direct investment from China in particular, from India to a degree as well, and Brazil and the Portuguese-speaking countries is a big player, Mozambique and Angola. But also now it's a source of some outward investment. So there are some multinationals of long standing from South Africa, but there are quite important interest and very interestingly organised ones from countries like Kenya and Uganda. And we don't have at the moment a network capable of addressing that, and we would like that. So if you are either interested or you know others who might be, please do get in touch. So I said it'd be a pitch, not a paper.
Thank you very much.